Merry Christmas again, everyone. It's a really special day where people are going to be gathering all over the place and celebrating Christmas in different ways. We all celebrate Christmas with different traditions and in different ways. And growing up, the way that my family would celebrate Christmas is I would always wake up and run into the living room. I was always the first one there. I was told I can't wake up mum and dad until the big hand reaches the 12 and the little hand reaches the 6. And then they would come out. My sister and I, we would be waiting, and my brother, he would still be asleep in bed, so we'd have to go and wake him up, and then we would all come into the living area. We would open up our Christmas sacks with presents from Santa, and then we would open up presents from one another. Dad would usually cook pancakes for breakfast, and then came this wonderful moment of actually being able to use the presents that we had been given. We would have a water fight later on in the day. My grandma would come around for lunch. We would fall into a food coma after lunch, and then we would head around my grandma's house for dinner. She would always make her Christmas trifle, and then we would finish off the day by listening to the Queen's Christmas speech. This was our Christmas pretty much every single year when I was young. We would have our Christmas tree, a wreath on the door, and nativity scenes all around the house. Now, one of the things I always wanted from my parents, and I asked of them a few different times, was for us to be a bit more creative with our nativity scenes. Maybe make it a little bit more exciting. And the reason that I felt this way was because I'd seen this episode of Mr. Bean at Christmas with this nativity scene, and it looked way more fun than the nativity scenes that we had in our house. Just check this out right now. Now, this is clearly not what the nativity scene looked like when Jesus was actually born. There were no tanks or helicopters or dinosaurs. There were definitely no Daleks at that time, but something else was a bit out of place in this nativity scene which you just saw. Now, can you think of what that might be? It's actually the wise men. Now, just have a look around your house. Kids, can you see around your house any nativity scenes where you can see some wise men? Now, there's nothing wrong with having wise men in our nativity scenes. It's just that they don't actually have too much to do with when Jesus was born. But in saying that, they have a lot to do with the story of Jesus. The wise men, they're actually called Magi, which comes from this word magus. Rather than simply being some guys who had some wisdom, the Magi were a group of people. They were a tribe from a certain nation. The Levites, they were the priestly tribe of Israel, and in the same way, the Magi were the priestly tribe of Persia, which is where they came from. We know that the Magi were wise men from the east, most likely Persia, which is modern-day Iran. And that means that they travelled somewhere between 1,200 to 1,500 kilometres to be able to see Jesus. The Magi would have come days, months, or even years after the time that Jesus was born, which is why it's strange that they're part of our nativity scenes. Tradition says that there were three wise men and that their names were Caspar, Melchior, and Balthazar. But since the Bible does not say, we actually have no way of knowing whether that's actually true. In recent days, many scholars have actually more widely accepted that it's fairly likely that there were several more Magi than just three. And the reason that these Magi came to meet Jesus is because in Daniel chapter 9, verses 24 to 27, there is this prophecy which gives a timeline for the birth of the Messiah from Israel. Also, the Magi, may have been aware of some of the prophecies from this guy Balaam, who was from a town near Persia. And in Numbers 24:17, we see a prophecy. And Balaam's prophecy specifically mentions a star that is going to come out of Jacob. You see, Daniel, who's from the Old Testament, he had previously been the chief of the court of the seers in Persia when the Israelites were exiled out to Persia. So the Magi would have had all of these Old Testament writings with prophecies about the Messiah who was going to come. And they would have rubbed shoulders with people like Daniel as he himself were making prophecies of the Messiah who was going to come. And it's because of these prophecies that they recognized the star and they followed it to go and see Jesus. And we see it here in Matthew 2, verses 1 to 12. Let's read together. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. When he had called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them, "Where is the Messiah was to be born?" "In Bethlehem in Judea," they replied, "for this is what the prophet has written. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." Then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me, so that I too may go and worship him." After they had heard the king, they went on their way, and the star they had seen, when it rose, went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route. Every story needs a good villain. In Star Wars, you've got Darth Vader. In Batman, you've got the Joker. In Thor, you have Loki. And in Die Hard, the greatest Christmas movie, you have Hans Gruber. In every great story, there is a protagonist who comes up against the hero. A guy called Robert McKee from Story Magazine says this: "The more powerful and complex the forces of antagonism opposing the character, the more completely realised character and story must become." And the villain of the story of Christmas is this guy. It's Herod. The Herod that is mentioned here is different to the Herod that was at the death of Jesus, who was Herod Antipas, who was this Herod's son. This Herod is immensely divisive as a person throughout history. Many people have called him Herod the Great because he had so many amazing building achievements, one of which was the second temple for the Jews. On the other hand, most people would consider him to be a tyrant and a dictator because of the lengths and the means that he went to be able to make a lot of these building achievements happen. Now, Herod, he was officially Jewish, but a lot of the Jewish people, they didn't view him as a full Jew. And the reason for this is because his father was a convert to Judaism. So he followed their religion, but he wasn't part of the same race as the Jewish people. There were two big issues for Herod which informed a lot of his tyrannical, dictatorial behaviour. Firstly, he was not seen as a full Jew by the masses, which is embarrassing for him. He desperately wanted the approval of the Jewish people, which is why he built them all of these amazing buildings. But secondly, he was constantly on guard because he knew that he was hated by many of the people who were full Jews. This went so far as to him even executing his own wife and 3 of his sons out of fear. He also ordered what was called the Massacre of the Innocents. He is officially history's worst family man of the year. He was deeply insecure due to his strange way of becoming a Jew, which was a conversion from his dad, and his strange way of becoming king. He became king because his dad was friends with Caesar. And this is the thing that seems to fuel a lot of his behaviour. He is afraid. He's afraid of losing the control that he has had for his entire life. And so when he hears about this child who is to come, who is called King of the Jews, that would have terrified him because he thought that he is the King of the Jews. And so he sends these Magi to the place where this king would be, to where the star was over Bethlehem. And it's there that they find this child with his mother, and immediately they seem to recognize this child as the Messiah. And they give him 3 different gifts: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Gold, it's a symbol of divinity and kingship. It points to the fact that Jesus was fully God and fully man, and that he was the king who would reign over an eternal kingdom. Any object of major significance in the ancient world was either made of gold or overlaid with gold. It was just as valuable back then as it is for us here today. Frankincense, it's a white resin or a gum. You would get it from a tree by making these cuts in the tree into the bark and allowing the gum to flow out from it. It is highly fragrant. It smells really great when it's burned, and therefore it was used in worship, where it was used as a pleasant offering to God. Frankincense, it's a symbol of holiness and righteousness. The gift of frankincense for Jesus, it was symbolic of his willingness to become a sacrifice, wholly giving himself up to God. Myrrh was gotten from Arabia, and it was gotten from trees in a very similar way that you would get frankincense. Myrrh, it symbolizes this bitterness and suffering and affliction. And so Jesus, he would grow to be someone who would need to pay this ultimate price when he gave his life on the cross for everyone who would believe in him. And all three of these gifts, they demonstrated the nature of who Jesus was going to be. The gold, it demonstrated his kingship. The frankincense demonstrated his righteousness. And the myrrh demonstrated his suffering. Now, the real question out of all of this for me is this question. How did the wise men know who Jesus was going to be when it seems like everyone else didn't? The Jewish people, and particularly the scholars, they had studied the same texts as the Magi. The Magi, they had just inherited these texts when the Israelites were in exile. They know about the nature of Jesus. They seem to know about the nature of his death in some way. They even know where to find him from a pretty visible sign in the sky, a star shining brightly. They would have had less training than the Jewish scholars, and yet they seem to recognize who Jesus is even more than the Jewish people. It even says in what we just read, when King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all of Jerusalem with him. The Magi worshipped Jesus, but other people, they were afraid. Why was this? The Jewish people, they were immensely nationalistic. They desperately wanted this conquering warrior to come as the king. What they had wanted was completely different from what had actually been promised and what the Magi had seen throughout Old Testament texts. The Magi, they came to Jesus with what they saw of him throughout the Old Testament. Although they maybe didn't understand certain things as well as some other Jewish scholars, they understood that Jesus would come humbly as a baby to bring good news, not just for the Jewish people, but the entire world. And here is the very core of the issue. The nation, they were thinking about what they could get from Jesus, but the Magi, they were thinking about what they could give to Jesus. The Magi, they travelled this great distance. The distance that they travelled is the equivalent from Brisbane to Townsville. That's not using cars, but that's through walking or riding on camels or horses. That's close to 500 hours worth of travel that they needed to do through treacherous terrain, all to be able to see this promised Messiah. And they brought these three gifts to Jesus. Some scholars have estimated that these gifts could have been worth as much in our day as $4 million in today's world. And it's likely that these gifts were used to enable Mary and Joseph to be able to flee into Egypt and then to be able to come back to Nazareth and settle in the area of Galilee. Ultimately, the gift that was brought to Jesus, it wasn't just these three gifts, but for the Magi, it was the gift of their heart. The Magi came not because they felt obligation, but because their hearts were moved by the possibility of being able to see Jesus, even when he was just a child. These gifts weren't something that Jesus needed to be able to do his work on earth, but it was a demonstration of their hearts and their attitudes towards Jesus. You see, Jesus' greatest commandment when he was here on earth is to love God. It's a commandment of the heart. And his second greatest commandment is to love others. And what Jesus wants for you this Christmas, nothing else except for your heart. He doesn't need it, but he wants it. He didn't need the Magi to bring him gifts, but they did it as a response to their hearts. And the song at Christmas time that I think represents this more perfectly than any other is "O Come, Let Us Adore Him." Jesus is the greatest gift that we could ever receive, but he is also desiring for you to give all of yourself to him this Christmas, to come and adore him. Jesus offers good news for the whole world, and the way that you receive this good news for yourself is by coming to him and giving him everything that you have. So let's come and adore Jesus together.